Peter is dead. Christians are being hunted, and one man must hold the church together. Today, we turn our attention to one of the most enigmatic figures in early Christian history, Linus, the man who succeeded Peter himself as the leader of the Christian community in Rome. While his predecessor's story is well documented in the New Testament and early Christian writings, Linus emerges from the shadows of history as a more mysterious figure, known primarily through scattered references in ancient texts and the testimony of early church fathers. Yet despite the scarcity of detailed information about his life, Linus holds an extraordinary position as the bridge between the apostolic age and the institutional church that would follow.
First of all, thank you for choosing to spend these moments with me and religion as it is. In this channel, we'll discuss topics of all religions, always respecting everyone's faith and beliefs. If this topic interests you, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and turn on notifications to be alerted of all new videos posted. Thank you and enjoy.
Our first encounter with Linus comes not from church history but from Scripture itself. In the second epistle to Timothy, written by the Apostle Paul during his final imprisonment in Rome, we find a brief but significant mention. As Paul faces his impending martyrdom, he sends greetings through his letter, writing, "Do your best to come before winter. Eubulus sends greetings to you, as do Pudens and Linus and Claudia and all the brothers." This passing reference takes on profound significance when we consider its context. Paul wrote these words while awaiting execution, likely in the year 64 or shortly thereafter. The fact that he mentions Linus by name suggests this man held a position of importance within the Roman Christian community. Paul was not simply listing random acquaintances. He was identifying those who remained faithful during a time of great peril, when many had abandoned him. The identification of this biblical Linus with the future Bishop of Rome comes primarily from Saint Irenaeus of Lyons, writing around the year 180. Irenaeus, who was a disciple of Polycarp, who in turn had been a disciple of the Apostle John, provides one of our most authoritative early testimonies. He explicitly states that the Linus mentioned in Timothy is the same person who would later lead the Roman Church. According to the Liber Pontificalis, an ancient compilation of papal biographies, Linus was born in Volterra, a hilltop town in the Tuscany region of central Italy. This walled settlement, perched on a mountainous terrain northwest of Rome, was known in ancient times as Volaterrae. The Liber Pontificalis further records that his father's name was Herculanus, suggesting he came from a family of some standing in the community. However, the reliability of these biographical details remains uncertain among modern scholars, as we cannot trace the origin of this information to sources contemporary with Linus himself. The Apostolic Constitutions, a 4th century compilation of ecclesiastical law, adds another intriguing detail. It names Linus's mother as Claudia. This has led some to speculate a connection with the Claudia mentioned immediately after Linus in Paul's letter to Timothy, though the Bible itself does not explicitly establish this relationship. If this identification is accurate, it would mean that both mother and son were part of Paul's circle in Rome, perhaps suggesting a family conversion to Christianity. We do not know when or how Linus became a Christian, or who first taught him the faith. What we can surmise from the available evidence is that he likely came to Rome as a young man, and there encountered the apostolic preaching that was transforming lives throughout the imperial capital. Traditional accounts, though impossible to verify, suggest he may have heard St. Peter preach and subsequently received baptism, entering fully into the Christian community. To understand Linus's significance, we must appreciate the world in which he lived and served. The Rome of the mid-1st century was the beating heart of an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. It was a cosmopolitan metropolis of perhaps 1 million inhabitants, where people from every corner of the known world mingled in its streets, markets, and forums. Within this vast urban landscape, the Christian community was still relatively small and vulnerable. Christianity had arrived in Rome through various channels: Jewish pilgrims returning from Jerusalem, merchants and travelers who had encountered the gospel in the East, and eventually through the ministry of Peter and Paul themselves. The Acts of the Apostles records Paul's arrival in Rome around 60 AD, where he spent 2 years under house arrest, receiving visitors and preaching with all boldness and without hindrance. The Christian community would have been concentrated in certain quarters of the city, particularly in areas where the Jewish population resided. The Trans-Tiberim district, across the Tiber River from the historic center, housed many Jews, and it is likely that early Christians lived among them. The eastern part of the Circus Maximus, near the Capena Gate, was another area with a significant Jewish presence, described by the Roman satirist Juvenal as a rather impoverished neighborhood. In July of the year 64 AD, an event occurred that would dramatically alter the circumstances of the Roman Christian community and shape the environment in which Linus would assume leadership. On the night of July 18th, a fire erupted near the Circus Maximus, in the commercial district filled with shops selling flammable goods. The conflagration rapidly spread through the wooden structures and narrow streets of ancient Rome. For 6 days, the flames consumed everything in their path. The fire briefly subsided, then reignited and burned for another 3 days. When it finally exhausted itself, the damage was catastrophic. Of Rome's 14 administrative districts, 3 had been completely obliterated, 7 more were severely damaged, and only 4 remained entirely untouched. Countless thousands found themselves homeless, their possessions reduced to ash. Temples, public buildings, and private dwellings alike had fallen victim to the flames. Emperor Nero, who according to the historian Tacitus was at his villa in Antium when the fire began, returned to the city and took measures to address the crisis. He opened his private gardens to refugees, arranged for grain to be sold at reduced prices, and began planning the reconstruction of the devastated areas. However, these efforts could not suppress the rumors that began to circulate among the population. Whispers that Nero himself had ordered the fire to clear space for his grandiose building projects, particularly his new palace, the Domus Aurea. To deflect blame and silence these damaging accusations, Nero required a scapegoat. He found one in the Christian community. Tacitus, writing several decades later, provides our most detailed account of what followed. He writes that Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. The persecution that ensued was brutal and public. Christians were arrested in large numbers. Some were torn apart by hunting dogs in the arena, providing gruesome entertainment for the masses. Others were crucified, their deaths transformed into public spectacles. Perhaps most horrifically, some were covered in pitch and set ablaze to serve as human torches, illuminating Nero's gardens during nocturnal festivities. Tacitus records an interesting detail. Despite the official propaganda blaming Christians for the fire, public sentiment began to turn against the emperor rather than the victims. The historian notes that even though Christians were generally despised for their alleged antisocial behavior and refusal to participate in traditional religious practices, the excessive cruelty of their punishment aroused pity. People began to perceive them not as dangerous criminals, but as victims of one man's savage cruelty. Among the victims of this Neronian persecution, tradition identifies 2 towering figures of early Christianity, the apostles Peter and Paul. While the exact dates of their deaths remain disputed among historians, most scholars place these events during or shortly after the persecution of 64 AD. Peter, according to ancient Christian tradition, was crucified upside down at his own request, considering himself unworthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. The location of his execution and burial would later become the site of the magnificent basilica that bears his name, the heart of Catholic Christianity. Paul, as a Roman citizen, was entitled to a more dignified execution and was beheaded, probably on the Via Ostiense, where the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls now stands. The loss of these 2 apostolic pillars left the Roman Christian community leaderless at a moment of supreme crisis. They needed someone to guide them through this period of terror, to maintain their organization and faith while avoiding further persecution. This was the context in which Linus emerged as a leader. The question of how and when Linus became Bishop of Rome is complicated by conflicting testimonies from ancient sources. The earliest and most authoritative account comes from Irenaeus of Lyons, writing around 180 AD in his work Against Heresies. Irenaeus states clearly, "After the holy apostles had founded and set the church in order in Rome, they gave over the exercise of the episcopal office to Linus." This testimony is supported by other early lists of Roman bishops compiled by Julius Africanus, Hippolytus, and Eusebius of Caesarea, as well as the Liberian Catalogue of 354. All of these sources place Linus immediately after Peter in the succession of bishops. Eusebius describes Linus as the first to receive the episcopate of the church at Rome after the martyrdom of Paul and Peter. However, not all ancient sources agree with this sequence. Tertullian, a Latin church father writing around 200 AD, asserts that Clement of Rome was the immediate successor to Peter. Jerome, the great biblical scholar, expresses some uncertainty on the matter, writing, "Clement was the fourth bishop of Rome after Peter, if indeed the second was Linus and the third Anacletus, although most of the Latins think that Clement was second after the apostle." Adding to the complexity, the Liber Pontificalis presents yet another scenario. It states that Peter consecrated two bishops, Linus and Anacletus, to handle the priestly duties of the community, while Peter himself devoted his energies to prayer and preaching. According to this account, it was actually Clement, to whom Peter entrusted the universal church, appointing him as his true successor. Some 4th century Christian writers attempted to reconcile these contradictions by suggesting that Linus actually served as a kind of auxiliary bishop or coadjutor during Peter's lifetime, handling administrative matters while Peter focused on his apostolic mission. The Apostolic Constitutions even claims that Linus was the first bishop of Rome and that he was ordained by Paul, while Clement was ordained by Peter. Modern scholarship generally accepts the testimony of Irenaeus as most reliable, since his account is earlier than the alternatives and was based on careful research into the existing lists of Roman bishops from the late 2nd century. The confusion in later sources may reflect the reality that early church leadership in Rome was more collegial than monarchical, with multiple presbyters or bishops sharing authority before a single episcopal office fully crystallized. Even the dates of Linus's pontificate are disputed among ancient sources. Eusebius and Jerome dated his episcopate from 68 to 80 AD, suggesting he served for approximately 12 years. The Liberian Catalogue offers more precision, stating that he served for 12 years, 4 months, and 12 days. However, this same source dates his tenure from 56 to 67 AD, during the reign of Emperor Nero. This earlier dating creates a significant problem. If Peter himself was martyred around 64 or 67 AD, how could Linus have already been serving as bishop from 56? This has led most modern scholars to reject the earlier dates as erroneous. The confusion may have arisen from attempts to assign specific consular dates to papal reigns, a practice that could easily introduce errors in calculation. The Catholic Encyclopedia, synthesizing various sources, suggests that Linus's pontificate most likely began around 64 or 67 AD and concluded sometime between 76 and 80 AD. The Annuario Pontificio, the Vatican's official directory, gives 68 AD as the starting date. These dates would place his entire ministry during a crucial transitional period in Roman history, the final years of Nero's reign, followed by the chaotic year of the 4 emperors in 68 to 69 AD, and then the establishment of the Flavian dynasty under Vespasian and his sons Titus and Domitian. Given the paucity of reliable contemporary sources, we know relatively little about what Linus actually did during his years of leadership. However, some accounts, though of uncertain historicity, have been preserved in later church documents. The Liber Pontificalis credits Linus with several specific actions. According to this source, he ordained 15 bishops, establishing episcopal leadership in communities beyond Rome. He also ordained 18 presbyters to serve the growing Christian population in the city itself. These ordinations, if historical, would represent a significant organizational development, establishing a clearer hierarchical structure within the Church. The same source attributes to Linus a decree requiring women to cover their heads when attending church services. This regulation was supposedly issued in conformity with the ordinance of St. Peter. However, modern scholars, including J.P. Kirsch in the Catholic Encyclopedia, dismiss this as apocryphal. The decree appears to have been simply copied from Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians, where he addresses this very practice, and then arbitrarily attributed to Linus by the later compiler of the Liber Pontificalis. Traditional accounts also suggest that during Linus's tenure, the Church enjoyed a relative period of peace. Between the Neronian persecution of 64 to 68 AD and the later persecutions under Domitian in the 90s, there appears to have been a lull in systematic state-sponsored violence against Christians. This does not mean the community faced no challenges. Local hostility, social ostracism, and sporadic violence likely continued. But there was no empire-wide campaign of extermination. This period of relative calm would have allowed Linus to focus on internal church matters, strengthening the faith of believers who had witnessed the horrific persecution of their brothers and sisters, integrating new converts, resolving disputes, maintaining contact with other Christian communities throughout the empire, and establishing liturgical practices and organizational structures that would endure. Linus's pontificate represents a crucial moment in the evolution of church government. The transition from the charismatic, apostolic leadership of Peter and Paul to the institutional leadership of their successors was not automatic or simple. Questions arose. Who had authority to make decisions? How should leaders be chosen? What was the relationship between the Roman Church and communities in other cities? While we cannot know the details of how Linus addressed these questions, we can observe that by the end of the 1st century, a clear pattern of episcopal governance was emerging. Each major Christian community had a single bishop, supported by a college of presbyters and assisted by deacons. The Bishop of Rome, as the successor to Peter in the imperial capital, held a special position of honor and authority. Linus's role in establishing this pattern cannot be precisely determined from our sources, but his very existence as Peter's acknowledged successor was itself significant. His leadership helped to establish the principle that apostolic authority could be transmitted through an orderly succession rather than dying with the apostles themselves. This principle of apostolic succession would become foundational to Catholic ecclesiology. According to the Liber Pontificalis, Linus died as a martyr and was buried in the Vatican, near St. Peter's tomb. His feast day, September 23rd, is still commemorated in the Roman calendar, and the traditional date of his death is given as September 23rd, 76 AD, though some sources place it as late as 79 or 80 AD. However, modern scholarship is deeply skeptical of the claim that Linus was martyred. J.P. Kirsch, writing in the Catholic Encyclopedia, states bluntly, "The statement that Linus suffered martyrdom cannot be proved and is improbable." His reasoning is straightforward. Between the persecution under Nero, which ended with that emperor's death in 68 AD, and the persecution under Domitian in the 90s, there is no evidence of any systematic persecution of the Roman Church. Irenaeus, when listing the early Roman bishops, specifically designates only Telesphorus as a glorious martyr, making no such claim for Linus. The Roman Martyrology, the official list of saints recognized by the Catholic Church, does not categorize Linus as a martyr. Its current entry simply states, "At Rome, the commemoration of Saint Linus, Pope, to whom, as Saint Irenaeus narrates, the blessed apostles entrusted the responsibility of the episcopate of the Church founded in the city." It is likely that the tradition of Linus's martyrdom arose from a later assumption that all the early popes must have been martyrs, given the dangerous environment in which they lived. The compiler of the Liber Pontificalis, writing centuries after the events, may have simply presumed that Linus met a martyr's death, even without documentary evidence to support this claim. The Liber Pontificalis also asserts that Linus was buried in the Vatican, next to St. Peter. We cannot determine the basis for this claim. given that Peter was indeed buried at the foot of the Vatican Hill, a fact confirmed by both ancient tradition and modern archaeological investigation, it is entirely plausible that his immediate successors were interred in the same location. The early Christian community would naturally have wanted to bury their leaders near the tomb of the chief apostle. An intriguing discovery occurred in 1615 during the construction of the present confession in St. Peter's Basilica. Workers found several sarcophagi, and one of them bore the letters limbs. This caused considerable excitement, as it seemed to confirm the ancient tradition. However, a manuscript by Torrigio, who reported the discovery, notes that these were merely the final 5 letters of a longer inscription. The complete name might have been Aquilinus or Annullinus, or any number of other Roman names ending in these letters. Moreover, the location of this sarcophagus's discovery does not correspond to where 4th century liturgical tradition would place Linus's tomb. Modern archaeological investigations beneath St. Peter's have not yielded any definitive evidence of Linus's burial site. The tradition remains just that, a tradition impossible to verify or falsify with certainty. In later centuries, several writings were attributed to Linus, though all are recognized as pseudonymous. One text purports to be an epistle written by Linus to the Eastern churches, describing the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul. Scholars universally recognize this as apocryphal, written considerably later than Linus's actual lifetime. There was also a tradition that Linus wrote an account of Peter's contest with Simon Magus, the sorcerer mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles. However, this text has not survived, if it ever existed. Some sources claim Linus wrote 2 books about Peter and Paul, which Cardinal Baronius believed had been corrupted by later interpolations and errors, departing from their original purity. These attributions reflect a common practice in ancient and medieval Christianity, attaching the names of apostolic figures to later writings to give them greater authority. The real Linus left no writings that have survived to our time, or more likely, never wrote any theological or historical works. His legacy lies not in his literary output, but in his faithful stewardship of the Roman Church during its formative years. Despite the frustrating gaps in our knowledge, we can assess Linus's historical significance with some confidence. He represents the crucial link between the apostolic age and the post-apostolic church. Without figures like Linus, willing to assume the mantle of leadership after the apostles' deaths, Christianity might have fragmented into disconnected communities with no institutional continuity. Linus's leadership, however modest and obscure it may have been, helped to establish several important precedents. First, it demonstrated that apostolic authority could be transmitted through an orderly succession. The Church was not dependent on the physical presence of those who had known Jesus personally. Their authority and mission could be passed to worthy successors. Second, Linus's position as Bishop of Rome helped to establish that city's preeminence within the larger Christian world. While many factors contributed to Rome's eventual primacy, its status as the imperial capital, the presence of Peter's tomb, its size and influence, the existence of an unbroken succession of bishops from Peter onward reinforced the city's special status. Third, Linus's tenure, coming as it did in the aftermath of persecution, likely helped to establish patterns for how the Church would respond to future persecutions. The community learned that it could survive the loss of its greatest leaders, that faith could endure through times of terror, and that patient endurance rather than violent resistance was the path forward. Throughout Christian history, Linus has been remembered, even if details of his life remain elusive. His name appears in the Roman canon of the Mass, the ancient Eucharistic prayer that dates back at least to the 4th century and possibly earlier. In this prayer, immediately after the consecration of bread and wine, the celebrant prays, "In communion with those whose memory we venerate, especially the glorious ever-Virgin Mary, Mother of our God and Lord, Jesus Christ, and blessed Joseph, her spouse, your blessed apostles and martyrs, Peter and Paul, Andrew, James, John, Thomas, James, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Simon, and Jude, Linus, Cletus, Clement, Sixtus, Cornelius, Cyprian, Lawrence, Chrysogonus, John and Paul, Cosmas, and Damian, and all your saints. The inclusion of Linus in this venerable list, mentioned by name immediately after the apostles and before all other early popes except Cletus and Clement, testifies to the early church's recognition of his importance. For nearly 2,000 years, Catholics throughout the world have heard his name proclaimed during the celebration of the Mass, even if most worshippers know nothing else about him. The Eastern Orthodox Church also venerates Linus as a saint, celebrating his feast on November 5th in the Byzantine calendar. Some Eastern traditions provide additional legendary details about his life, though these cannot be verified through historical sources. Contemporary historians approach the figure of Linus with appropriate scholarly caution. We must acknowledge the limitations of our sources. Irenaeus wrote more than a century after Linus's death, and the Liber Pontificalis was compiled several centuries later still. We possess no contemporary accounts of his ministry, no documents he himself wrote, no physical artifacts that can be definitively linked to him. Some scholars have questioned whether Linus even existed as a distinct individual, or whether the name might represent a collective leadership during the post-apostolic period. However, this skepticism is probably excessive. The consistent testimony of multiple independent early sources, the specific biblical reference in 2 Timothy, and the absence of any obvious motive for fabricating such a figure all suggest that Linus was indeed a real person who led the Roman Christian community in the late 1st century. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: in the aftermath of the Neronian persecution and the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul, the Christian community in Rome did not dissolve or disappear. It continued, grew, and eventually thrived. Someone provided leadership during those crucial transition years. The earliest reliable sources identify that person as Linus, a man of sufficient faith, wisdom, and courage to guide his community through one of the most challenging periods in its history. There is something poignant about Linus's historical obscurity. He followed the most renowned of the apostles and preceded a long line of popes who would wield enormous influence over Western civilization. Yet Linus himself remains in shadow, known primarily through his connection to Peter rather than for any achievements of his own. This obscurity itself carries a spiritual lesson. Not all those who serve faithfully leave detailed historical records. Not all who contribute significantly to God's work receive recognition in history books. Linus did his duty in a difficult time, maintained the faith, and passed the torch to the next generation. For Christian believers, this is accomplishment enough, regardless of whether later ages remember the details. Saint Jerome, writing in the late 4th century, captures something of Linus's position when he describes him simply as the first after Peter to be in charge of the Roman Church. This minimalist description is perhaps the most accurate we can offer. Linus was Peter's immediate successor, a man who bridged the apostolic and post-apostolic eras, and who thus occupies a unique and important position in the history of Christianity. Pope Linus remains one of the most enigmatic figures in Christian history. We know he existed, we know he led the Roman Church in the crucial decades after Peter's death, and we know he is remembered with honor in Christian tradition. Beyond these bare facts, we must acknowledge the limits of our knowledge. Yet perhaps this very uncertainty has its own value. Linus reminds us that the history of the Church is not only the story of famous saints and dramatic events. It is also the story of countless faithful individuals who served quietly, often in difficult circumstances, without seeking recognition or glory. Linus stands as a representative of all those whose names we do not know, whose deeds were not recorded, but whose faithfulness made possible the survival and growth of the Christian faith. In an age that often values fame and recognition above all else, Linus's obscure but faithful service offers a counter-narrative. His legacy is not found in great writings, miraculous deeds, or dramatic martyrdom. His legacy is simply this: he was there when he was needed, he did what had to be done, and he passed on to his successors a living, functioning church. For those 2,000 years of Christians who have heard his name proclaimed in the Roman canon, Linus is honored not for what we know about him, but for what he represented. the continuation of apostolic leadership, the preservation of faith through persecution and transition, and the quiet faithfulness that has characterized so many servants of the Church throughout the ages. As we conclude this examination of the second Pope, we are left with more questions than answers. But perhaps that is fitting. Linus invites us not to certainty, but to faith, not to detailed knowledge, but to trust in the providence that guided the early Church through its most vulnerable years. He reminds us that the Church's foundation rests not on the fame of its leaders, but on the faithfulness of ordinary people empowered by extraordinary grace. The man from Volterra who walked the streets of Nero's Rome, who witnessed persecution and martyrdom, who assumed leadership when it would have been safer to hide, who maintained the faith when others abandoned it. This man deserves our respect and remembrance, even if the details of his life remain forever beyond our reach. Saint Linus, Pope and Confessor, pray for us.